I have the privilege and pleasure to introduce Edgar Arceneaux. Edgar Arceneaux is one of my closest friends. We've known each other for quite some time. We kind of have the same trajectory in the sense that he went to Art Center, College of Design for undergrad, and then he went to Cal Arts for his graduate studies. So I'm just going to read you a couple of things because I think it's important. I'm not going to, I mean, if I read everything, it's done. The whole workshop's going to be done, you know. But I'll just read you a couple of little things that I think are important to situate, this kind of experience together. Edgar Arceneaux is an artist working in the media of drawing, sculpture, and performance, whose work often explores connections between historical events and present-day truth. He played a seminal role in the creation of the Watts House Project, a redevelopment initiative to remodel a series of houses around the Watts Towers, serving as director from 1999 to 2012, which he'll be talking about today. His work has been featured at the Hammer Museum in Los Angeles, the Whitney Biennial, Whitney Museum of American Art, New York, the Studio Museum in Harlem, New York, Performa 15, New York, and the MIT List Visual Arts Center, Cambridge, Massachusetts, among other venues. And he is an associate professor of art at the Roski School of Art and Design at USC, and he lives in Pasadena. So it's my pleasure to introduce Edgar, and thanks for being here with us.
Thank you all for coming. So we do have a lot to cover today, but I'm just curious, where's everybody coming from? Is there anyone here outside of California? Oh, good. A good 4 of you. Okay, fantastic. All right. And the rest of you are all local? San Francisco? Okay, wonderful. And who's coming from the farthest place? Anybody here from Alaska? No? Where are you coming from? Dallas. Both of you coming from Dallas? Okay, fantastic. All right, I'll make sure this lecture is worth it, okay? Worth all the drive. So, like Nettie said, we're really old friends. We've known each other now more than 15 years. I knew Nettie back when he was a baby. He was still walking around in diapers. He was very cute. Our practices have been intertwined. We've collaborated together. We both teach and are really interested in an art that can be politically engaged, but also intellectually stimulating and beautiful. And we've attacked this problem in different ways. So I wear many different hats, and one of them, I would say, is of those different hats, one of the things that kind of combines them all together is this question of what constitutes a practice, and can you wear different hats at the same time? And what I would like to do with this lecture is to maybe kind of dispel with that particular kind of mental picture and try to approach this in a slightly different way. Because I'm a visual artist and I show in museums and galleries, and I do have a studio practice. And I'm also, currently I'm a theater director. I'm working on my second play, but I've also founded my own arts nonprofit. I'm a father, I'm a husband, I'm a lecturer, a thinker, a writer, lots of different things. I can't talk about all of that, but what I'm going to try to do is to kind of summarize things in a way that I think will be succinct enough for an hour-long conversation. So in my practice, this is kind of an equation that I've come up with that I think makes sense for me. Because partial of the way that I make money is by selling art. I have a gallery that I work with both in the US and in Paris. So I would say that 50% of my time is spent doing things that I don't get paid to do, right? Or that I might get paid to do, but I never get paid as much as it's worth. And then the other part of it is things that I can sell art or get paid through my teaching gig. For many of you, I'm wondering, how is this a central question for you? Can we find a balance between art making and teaching? For how many of you is this sort of a big question for you? Okay, good. Good. Okay, so let's continue. So, oftentimes this question about art making and can I be an educator or a teacher is really at the heart of it is a financial question, which can I afford to do both, right? And if I can I have a synergistic relationship between these two things? So at first I want to just frame this presentation as a discussion around support. So over the last 7 years, I've been doing a research project called New Financial Architectures for Creative Communities. And this is a project that's looking at the relationship between where our support comes from and the feedback that it has within the content of our work. Because oftentimes what we find happening is that we get a job to support our practice, and increasingly the job gobbles up more and more time, right? So this equation that I came up with here for financial architecture is me thinking about our support in relationship to our own temperament and values, right? Because for most of us as creative people, we are doing this out of a passion. And this passion, it's oftentimes manifests itself as an expression of joy. Or that joy becomes the energy that drives that passion, but it's a renewable resource, like it has to be replenished, because if it gets burned out, then the quality of our work goes down, we don't enjoy it as much, and then we find ourselves sort of moving into other domains. But oftentimes when we come up with a project or a purpose or a mission or a vision, so oftentimes when we come up with a mission or a purpose or an intention or a project, how we wind up organizing ourselves or how we try to get support, we wind up becoming in service increasingly of trying to raise the money as opposed to actually doing the thing that we're raising the money for. The other ramification of that is that sometimes when we organize ourselves, we can find ourselves creating power dynamics that we don't like. Like it could become very top-down or pyramidal, more pyramid-like, as opposed to maybe your temperament and values is much more collaborative in spirit, right? And it could produce relationships or sour on relationships, but all these things work together. And what I would like to try to describe for you today is my attempt at trying to find a balance between my own personal temperament and values and my own financial architecture. So I'm going to focus on 2 projects today. Like I said, I've been directing in theater for the last 5 years, which is something new for me. I guess 5 years now doesn't make it new any longer, but I hadn't directed a play before. I did my first one in 2015, and I'm working on a second one now. But I also started my own nonprofit back in 2009 called Watts House Project. So it's an artist-driven neighborhood redevelopment project down around the Watts Towers. So I'm going to talk about these 2 things in relationship to being an educator and an artist and how I've tried to like merge those 2 things together, but also really try to zero in on the financial structures and how I've tried to build support around this. So when I say support, what I mean is funding, but what I also mean is everything else which is not money, right? So here's a list for you. Feel free to shoot a picture of this if you want. But I've tallied about 20 different forms of support here, and I would task all of you to think about how many of these are you actually using currently. For me, on this list, I'm probably using at least 2/3 of them at any given moment, okay? So at the top, we're talking about support, which is a form of sweat equity. How many of you guys are familiar with this term, sweat equity? They use it, so volunteerism, right? So everybody here has used volunteerism at some point. Social networks, information, those are everywhere, right? We all have access to these things. That is also a resource. How many of you guys think about marriage or a life partner as a resource? For a lot of us artists, it's the first time we get health insurance as adults when we marry someone who has benefits and a real job. I tell everybody, particularly young folks, really think very carefully about who you marry. Try to marry up if you can. Associative power, how many of you are familiar with that term? Okay, so if I told you guys that my sister is a makeup artist with Dwayne Johnson, would you think that was something cool? Would you think of me a little bit differently knowing that he and I hang out and have drinks together? Do you see me a little differently now because of my association with him? That's not true. I don't hang out with him, but my sister is his makeup artist. But through association, having connections and relationships to other people, it is a form of resource and opportunity, which you can leverage towards things. Donations, cash, grants. How many of you guys have have gotten a commission to do something? Okay, so commissions are awesome. It's paid in advance. That's great. How many of you have considered creating a membership for your projects? Something through Patreon, for example, as a membership service. How many of you are familiar with Patreon? Okay, just write that down. It's like Patriot, but Patreon. It's like a Kickstarter for services. Memberships are great. There's a thing that's called 1,000 True Fans. How many of you guys are familiar with this model for support? So 1,000 True Fans, basically the idea is that if you have 1,000 people whom are willing to give you, let's say, $1 a month to support your work, each month you could rely upon that $1,000 to come in from your supporters to underwrite sort of your basic operations of your practice. Let's say if they gave you $2 a month, then you would have $2,000. Let's say if they were willing to give you $10 a month, you would have to figure out how to give them something in return, oftentimes as perks or gifts. That's how Patreon works, that's how Kickstarter works. But 1,000 True Fans is a model for a lot of people whom are like me, who pride themselves on making a lot of stuff that can't really pay for itself, okay? So we'll come back to this list if you want. I want you to notice I did put exploitation at the bottom. That is also a resource, and it happens oftentimes in the community of the arts. But if anyone wants to talk about cryptocurrency or barter systems or re-scripting budgets, I'm happy to do that after the end of the talk. Like I said, I am going to talk about two projects. A Watts House project that spent 15 years working on this. It's a neighborhood redevelopment project in Watts. But in particular, I'm going to talk about these four things. That is a neighborhood, it was an art project, it was also an educational instrument, but it was also a space for mutual benefit. Right, so this was a project that took place in a neighborhood. As well as my play, Until, which is based on a performance that the actor Ben Vereen did in 1981 at Ronald Reagan's inaugural gala, which he performed in blackface. And there was a section of that performance that was never aired. I'm going to go into that a little bit more. But because I was doing a play that had a public benefit, I created a project that was incubated by a fiscal receiver called fulcrumarts. So technically, I'm operating as a nonprofit in some of my work, which means I could take donations. So I'm going to share some of that information with you guys as well. But also the way in which I'm able to take my practice now and divide it amongst these three areas: the studio work, my non-for-profit work, and then my home expenses. And the idea is to make all three of these things operate synergistically, but that they all kind of are self-sustaining. Okay, so Watts House Project was an ongoing collaborative artwork in the shape of a neighborhood redevelopment in the neighborhood of the Watts Towers, which is just in South LA, kind of in the juncture where the 105 and the 110 freeway meets. How many of you have been there before? Okay, fantastic. Okay, great numbers there. So a lot of people haven't been there before. But in this neighborhood, it's actually been an arts neighborhood for more than 80 years. There's an art center that was built there, I think, in the 1950s. We worked there directly with the families that were around the Watts Towers to leverage local skill sets with unique partnerships. So folks who worked there in the neighborhood, primarily, most of them were artisans or did general contracting work. They worked in other neighborhoods to improve them, but when they came home, they didn't have the means to do it for themselves. So it didn't take a genius to think, hey, if I can raise some money as an artist and bring all these folks together, we can really transform this neighborhood in the way in which they've already been doing, but at a much smaller scale. Like, we can scale that up and bring volunteers in and then turn it into a space of mutual benefit. So folks can be learning things, they could be leaving something behind, they could be taking something with them. So this is the Watts Towers neighborhood. So here's the towers here. They were built by an Italian immigrant by the name of Simon Rodia, who only had a 5th grade education. And he said he wanted to make something big, right, which he did. This tallest tower here is 99.5 feet tall. And one of the great things about this project is that it's smack dab in the middle of a residential neighborhood. So it's completely surrounded by children and families. Right, so the Watts Towers Art Center is here. They built another art center here, which is all part of the city family. And all of this used to be a giant railway station. But the property was eventually sold to the city, and it just stayed there. It's just like giant dirt mounds. But when artists would come there, oftentimes they would do stuff here in this area, but they would never engage with the residents. So I just started with one family. We sat down. We came up with an idea for a project, which was to create a new driveway. So this was the Madrigal family. They're one of the oldest families who'd been there in the neighborhood, and they were really wonderful, welcomed me into their home. We would sit down in their living room, talk about the neighborhood. You know, we would have, tamales, and he would give me, food to eat and drink whenever I would come and visit. But we discovered that there was a problem, which was that whenever Felix would park in his driveway, he would get a ticket because the driveway was unpaved. It was just dirt. But when he would park in front of his house, right here, you can see that the street is really narrow. He would get ticketed there as well. So annually, him and his family would get something like $1,000 in parking tickets a year. So the deal with Watts House Project was that the only thing that the family had to do was to ideate the project with me, help to realize it together, and then to maintain it, right? They didn't have to put any of their money in. All we were asking for was sweat equity and investment, and then return on investment would be cumulative improvement to the neighborhood, aesthetically. But there was another thing that we're trying to get out, but I'm going to come back to that. So working with some of Felix's friends, we were able to pay them a third of the money. It cost us a third of the money, and also we did it in a third of the time. So normally a 3 or 5 day project, we did in a day and a half. And you can see here that Felix is doing all the heavy work and that I was shooting the photographs. No, okay. So actually I was out there too. I have a profound appreciation for people who pour concrete. If you've never seen it before, it's like ballet. It's incredible. But just to reiterate, when I started working on this project in Watts in 1996, and I took over in 1999, I had zero experience working in community. So I used to be an art teacher down in South Central LA. I started doing that when I was at Art Center because I really wanted to be involved in the city. I grew up in South Central, not too far. If you guys are familiar with the movie Boys in the Hood, I grew up maybe like 5 blocks from where they shot that movie. And we left LA in 1984, the same year that the Olympics came to LA, because my family was, increasingly concerned about the rise of gangs and drugs that were in our neighborhoods. So we left LA. But then 8 years later, when I saw the LA uprising happen and the city went up in flames, I was like, what can I do? Right? Is there something that I can do to help to rebuild the city? But as an artist, I felt a little bit disempowered. So when I got to Art Center, I was there for about a year. I met an artist by the name of George Evans who said, why don't you come and teach with me down in South LA? I went there one Saturday. We're in an old fire station, and I stayed for 3 years. Right? But what I didn't know was just me following my passion to teach and to work with kids was that I could probably trace my entire art career back to that little fire station. Because there were artists that came there. There was an artist who came and invited me to participate in a show at MoCA. A German art collector saw those photographs. He invited me to come to Germany. I moved to Germany for 2 months and did an artist in residency. And then I wound up getting 2 galleries and then traveling back and forth from between Europe ever since. I was like in 2000, that was like 1998, 1999. So all that stuff sort of all happened just about me just being in the space of trying to give back somehow, right? And following my temperament and my values, right? So that was only experience that I had. I didn't know how to knock on people's doors and say, hey, I'm an artist. You don't know me at all, but can I work on a project with you? But the thing is that, in a neighborhood like this, all you need to do is meet one family who believes in you, right? You get one person to buy in, and then they can convince everybody else to join you. So essentially, if you're working in a neighborhood, there's 3 or 4 factors that will help you to really connect to a place, okay? So the first one is that you need to have one family that is gonna believe in what it is that you're trying to do. Right, somebody who's going to give you some credibility. The second thing is that whatever project you decide to do should grow organically from that place. Right. So if people were doing crocheting, then your project should be centered around crocheting. Fortunately, there were a lot of people there who knew how to use heavy tools and paint and do driveways. Those are things that I have a passion for. So we all kind of bonded together around that. The third thing is having some proximity to some infrastructure, like the Watchtowers Art Center really incubated us. They were our office space for a while. And then the Madrigals, we used to stay in their living room. They let me store stuff in there, like a printer and things like that. A place to have meetings. And then the fourth thing is a place that people can point at and say, I know where that is. So for us, that was the Watchtowers, or the Watchtowers neighborhood. So those 4 things helped us to be able to connect to the place, be able to have an idea for something that meant something to people there, and something that I could share with people like you, and you would understand, hey, I know why he's doing that, and why they would want to do that with him. Let me just show you a couple of other things that we did. So one of the things that I pride ourselves on is that if we had an idea for a project, we would start on Monday and be done by Friday. So with Rosa Gutierrez and her family, you can see there's an old truck in front, and she had a rickety old chain link fence, and her house is literally across the street from the entrance to the tower. So there would be 10,000 tourists would come through there every year, but whenever Rosa would see tourists outside, she would wait until they would leave because she was embarrassed by the way that our house looked. So, you know, working with an artist, Carolyn Castano, we invited her to come down and do a mural that she proposed to us. And then at the end, this is what the front of the house looked like. So we did it during the Watchtowers Jazz Festival. We had lots of kids came out and volunteered. We put out a big call for volunteers. It was a lot of fun, music, food. And again, the residents were never asked to pay for any of it. We fundraised for it all. Only thing we asked them to do is maintain it. But then people heard about it. It was like, oh, we love what you're doing. So we had like JetBlue, and I think it was Pepsi. I forget what the organization was. They reached out to us and said, hey, this sounds really awesome. We're going to bring our 30 volunteers down. And they paid for all the grass, all the plants and everything. Rosa designed it, and we put it in the ground. This is the part where I think is kind of critical for the story that we're exploring today about an art practice and an educator's practice. Because I think the question that we have to ask ourselves is, am I a teacher or am I an educator? And a teacher and an educator, they overlap, but they really are two different things. Because a teacher oftentimes is connected to a building, is connected to an institution, is connected to a space. But if you're an educator, it's a much broader idea, because an educator can educate anywhere they go. But also an educator is someone who learns from the place that they're in. They're an active learner, and they're constant. And they realize that education is about reciprocation, right? So in the instance of working in WHP, even though we came in there just thinking about renovations, like, hey, I'm an artist, we could paint a wall, we can do a new fence, like that's in my gear house. But increasingly, we realized that if we weren't working to improve the infrastructure of what was going on inside the home, then we were essentially laying the seeds for displacement, or what's known as gentrification, right? It became pretty clear to me that I was constantly moving into domains in which I really didn't know what I was doing. But I kind of just had a deeper belief in the process that I would learn in the process of also giving back. Because folks said, hey, Edgar, we want to organize more. Because we went from having one family to 2 to 3 to 5 to 7. So we started off first, it was like 3 of us. And then at the end, when I left in 2012, it was like 57, 60, 70, 80 people involved. It just kind of just really grew. We started off one year only having like $6,000. And then by the end of 2012, when I left, we raised something like $750,000. So it really did grow, but people wanted it. They wanted programming, they wanted training, you know, they wanted a space, they wanted a hub, you know. So we created all of these things, just piecing it together with bubblegum. Like, okay, people know people need this. We don't really have the structure for it, but let's just try to make it happen. And it all just kind of started piecing together. And I learned on the School of Hard Knocks, like how to do all of these things. But what I did understand really at the heart of it was that it didn't matter how many fences we built or how many things we painted, was that if we weren't creating conocimiento, how many of you guys are familiar with this phrase, conocimiento? All right, so it's something that you should write down and really try to embrace as an artist, too, is that conocimiento is about turning strangers into friends. Do you guys want to be my friend? So this is how it starts, just a conversation. You know, and then from building rapport, you can build trust. And from trust, you can co-power. In the instance of working down at Watts, we were co-building. Because the more people that we brought in, the more friends we made, the more we could do. So of the 5 construction projects, I'm just going to show you one. So this one, we were working with the School of Architecture at USC, and we were able to convince a wealthy philanthropist, actually, Jeffrey Soros. Some of you guys are familiar with the Soros family. They're like big political donors. You guys don't know the Soroses? Okay. So this is Jeffrey Soros. This is the nephew. of one of the most politically active Soroses. And they gave us some money to be able to buy these 3 properties. And they were built in the early 1920s, really beautiful old shotgun houses. But folks in the neighborhood were like, we want a space, we want to be able to use it. So, okay. So it looked like this, but then working with the schools, with the students at USC, at the end, it looked like this. But this was just a facade improvement. What people wanted was something more. So I called this the platform because I was thinking about like the way in which the cell phone at the time was a platform. Like I was really inspired by technology then. This is before like our democracy was being sold up the river by Facebook, and we realized that it was a giant surveillance tool. Don't you guys remember how idealistic we were in the early 2000s about the internet? So we called it the platform, and the idea was that depending upon the needs of the user, it could change over time. So if folks in the neighborhood needed a space to have a birthday party, they can do that. A quinceañera, God forbid, a funeral, like this could be their neighborhood hub. I mean, unfortunately, I was not able to see this project through before I left the organization, but this was one of the projects that we did. One of our families wound up being pushed out of their home because they were renters, and they were able to move into this property. So this idea of building infrastructure, so Rosario Alvarez, who was from Acapulco, really loved to cook, and she was like, Edgar, it would be great if we'd be able to do more. And so we worked together. We created like a menu for her, photos of her food, and then she started catering all of our events. So very slowly with each event, we would pay her, she would buy equipment, and just slowly sort of built her infrastructure until she was able to start a catering business. Around that same time, we were working with her husband, Hanaro, who wanted to learn how to weld. So his very first project that he did was welding a fence for us. And since then, he's become a licensed contractor. We actually work with him. We paid for him to get his license. He's a licensed contractor, and he does it for a living. So, these are sort of part of the legacies of, of art and education kind of working together. It can really transform people's homes. So part of the thing that I'm hoping that you guys get from this is that an art practice is very expansive in what it can be. And what I tried to prove with WHP when I worked on it for those 15 years is that art is not just an object, but that art is a force that could be directed towards anything. It can be, towards a driveway, a fence, or the building of an innovative organizational system, right? It can be an object. But for us, every time we did something and it looked amazing and people would drive down the street, the artwork really was the thing that just triggered more people to want to get involved. Because when rich people would come down there and they would be confronted with all of their biases around the isms of, of race and class, but if you put 2 people who are different on the same project and then at the end they can both step back together and be like, look at what we did, then you've created some conocimiento. And oftentimes those people had a lot of money who would come down and volunteer, and they would give it to some. They would give us some of it. Right? So very slowly it was just bubble gum and grassroots work, and we're able to build an infrastructure and then actually get genuine support. So just to talk about like the nuts and bolts of WHP, when we first started off as just a few of us, but very slowly we started to go to different institutions and say, hey, we're working on this project. Don't you think it's great? Don't you want to give us some money to do this? So the Hammer Museum was one of our first with LACMA. And we worked with Art Center College of Design, the USC School of Architecture, and then I taught a class, that thing with Rosario, when we created her menu. That was a class at USC at Roski. Now, I didn't know that 7 years later I'd be a full-time professor there, but it was that project allowed me entryway into the university at a level of engagement, both within the administration, but also within faculty, that then when I did apply for a full-time job, I already had credibility within that program, right? It gave me a leg up from all the other people who were applying for that job. Do you get what I'm sort of getting at here about the strange kind of interweaving of these relationships forming? So CB2, that's Crate and Barrel Tour, if you guys know that company, buy stuff from there. Andy Warhol Foundation gave us a big grant, but then also Art Place. How many of you are familiar with Art Place? So one of you. Okay, so write that down, artplaceinamerica.org. They give out millions of dollars a year in support for projects that are at this interface that we're talking about right now between design, visual art, culture, and the intersection of education and neighborhood engagement, social engagement, improvement, right? They gave us $375,000, which is the biggest grant we had ever received, which was fantastic. A friend of mine just got a grant from them for $500,000 for projects he's doing in Milwaukee. So it doesn't have to be a massively big project. It just needs to be interesting and engaged with something that's real. So I'm showing you the Until, not because I want all of you to go into theater, which you should, because it's fun. And again, I'm constantly throwing myself into situations where I'm completely an amateur. I've directed some movies in the past, so I'm not completely inexperienced, but for a live stage, I'd never done it before. And I loved it. I got bit by the bug. So I'm going to show you the trailer for Until.
Ladies and gentlemen, as I'm sure you know, at the turn of the century, was a segregated theater. And a black man, in order to appear at a white man's show, had to put on a black face so no one would know. And one of the giant stars of that era in the Ziegfeld was Bert Williams. And he kind of made fun of men's follies and foibles through his humor. And here tonight, to play tribute to Bert Williams, is Ben Vereen.
My name is Edgar Arceneaux, and I'm a Los Angeles-based artist and filmmaker. 20 years ago, I saw video footage of a performance given by Ben Vereen at Ronald Reagan's inaugural ball in 1981. In it, Ben wears blackface and performs a moving tribute to pioneer African-American actor Bert Williams. When ABC broadcast the performance the following day, they intentionally omitted the last part containing the critique. Audiences only saw Ben in blackface performing a minstrel show, lampooning black Americans. Outrage ensued, creating a fierce media backlash by the very community he was there to represent. The aftermath left Ben isolated, derailed his career, and made him feel like a man without a country. So the progressive politics of Ben's performance has never been fully understood.
Is that right? Oh, no, sir. No, sir, that's quite all right.
30 years later, scars still remain.
Oh, you want to see the video?
Until is my new live-action play, commissioned by Performer in New York, that will restage Ben Vereen's intended performance so contemporary audiences can experience it in full force.
I just forget my place sometimes. Yes, sir.
Yeah, so it was really cool. You know, it was my first time doing a performance. We actually won the top prize in the festival, which was great. After Donald Trump got elected, I was like, hey, I got something I can do to like try to confront what I consider is like an absolute inability for people of difference to have a conversation with each other. So I decided to try to tour this piece around the country. And I've shown the video, the film of it in different parts of the world, and also I've toured it in 5 different cities across the US and hope to continue doing that. But you know, in the process of doing Until, I had to figure out how to build a company to support that. And one of the things that I did, which I actually think was a mistake, but because it wasn't the right thing for me, was that I turned Watts House Project from an art project into a nonprofit in 2009 or 2010. How many of you have started your own nonprofits before? How many of you have worked for a nonprofit? Okay. They oftentimes can be very administratively bureaucratic, and one of the things that you discover about working in a nonprofit and then building your own nonprofit is that you essentially have 2 jobs when you have a nonprofit. One is to run the nonprofit, and then the second job is to do the thing that you want the nonprofit to do. Within our current economic system, increasingly when artists want to work at a certain scale, that it wants to push you outside of the creative space and turn you into a manager and a fundraiser. How many of you have experienced that before? Yeah, it's sort of the condition. And it's oftentimes the thing that then pits our passion against the practicality of us being able to do the thing that we want to do without the fear of financial ruin, right? Student loan debt, children, aging parents. You know, for folks who have children, you know, the art world is also very difficult. It's very challenging for them as well, because you have that additional responsibility. Not to say that dads don't, but oftentimes, you know, that's a sort of another thing that can affect a person's life, particularly women. And so, you know, what I've tried to do in my career is to figure out ways of building support for things that I think people won't necessarily want to pay for in advance, and try to maintain my joy while doing it. How many of you maintaining the joy is important? How do you feel like you were able to do that most of the time? Yeah, no, most of the time. Even when stuff is hard, it can still be joyful. But oftentimes, you know, we can find ourselves kind of spinning our wheels. So the thing that I decided to do differently in my practice now, which was different from Watts House Project, was that Watts House Project was here as a nonprofit, and then my studio practice was here, and then my home and my studio practice, basically those 2 pools of money were completely intertwined. And I found that I was pitting them against each other because my living expenses and my studio expenses were in competition with each other, right? At least psychologically as well, they were just being pitted against each other. So what I've done is that I now, I've broken them off into like 3 different sections, 3 different areas that I believe are interconnected or linked, if you will. Yeah, no. Cheeseburger kicking in. I worked on that all day. Okay, so, but you know, the idea is that each project should pay for itself, right? But these things are interconnected. So let me just talk about the Fiscal Receiver for a second. So how many of you guys have worked with a Fiscal Receiver before? I'm one person, okay. What have you done with the Fiscal Receiver?
I worked on a grant with a collaborative individual who
Yeah.
was a sponsor.
Who was a sponsor, okay. Do you want to explain to them what the sponsor did?
Arts Connection of San Bernardino, they're the Arts Council for San Bernardino, so they basically put their name on the grant to sponsor it, to say that they're down pretty much, and because I was a part of a nonprofit, they were able to then receive and funnel the funds through Arts Connection.
Yeah, that's right. So the fiscal, so the charity basically, you know, what the charity does is that it allows for money to come in from all sorts of different places, right? So it can be from a foundation, it could be from an individual, right? So if you have at least for arts nonprofits, they're called 501c3s. So you can have money coming in from all sorts of different places, foundations, individuals. Hey, even you can donate money to your 501c3, right? Or to a 501c3 as well. And the idea is that when the IRS is involved, they basically become your boss, which kind of sucks. If you are part of a 501c3, you also have to create a board of directors, right? And then you also have to get insurance for those board of directors. You have to have a secretary. You have to have someone that oversees your finances and your taxes. And all these things exist because 501c3s easily become places for embezzlement, for like, you know, putting money in and then, you know, I probably shouldn't say too many bad things about our president, but you know, he's figured it out. He knows how to do it. You know, and a lot of rich people do. But the way in which a fiscal sponsor works, or a fiscal receiver, and a good one, what they'll do is that they'll offer you a place to be able to receive all of that cash, right? So all that money goes back in there again, and they take a percentage of that money, but you don't get, there's no taxes on you, right? And that's one of the great benefits of getting yourself a fiscal receiver is that you can do projects that are really passionate to you, but that you may not necessarily want to pay for it yourself. So you can apply for grants, you can you know, get individual donations through Kickstarter, you can hit up your family for money, do a bake sale, whatever you want to do. Everything goes through the fiscal receiver, and the one that I use is called fulcrumarts, and they're in Pasadena. Now, a good fiscal receiver should also offer you services, like they help you to apply for grants. They will do all of your taxes. They do all of your bookkeeping. They do all of your profit and loss statements. All the things that none of us love to do, they do that for you. So again, just to come back to this slide about support, the more of these that you are using, the more capacity that you have to be able to build a system in which you're able to support not only yourself as an educator and an artist, but you could perhaps become a philanthropist yourself, right? Be able to support other people's projects too. So this question, you know, how can my art practice and art education practice be supportive of each other? That's where we started, right? And philosophically, I think this distinction is important. Where I think as an educator, you're more nomadic, but as a teacher, you tend to be more rooted and grounded in one place, anchored down. So as an educator, you're not tied to a school, but to a mission. You can be an educator no matter where you go. You know, you're an active learner, you're a participant, and you're somehow connected to social change, even if it's just touching the life of one person. But philosophically, this is how I think about art, and the reason why I think that it makes a very powerful tool is because I don't think that art is inherently good or bad, but that it is inherently contradictory. Its unruliness, its power comes from the fact that it forces us to ask questions. And in that regard, it's discursive. It is the dialogue. It is about exchange. I mean, and that is the heart of education, isn't it? So is there a division? I don't think that there is. I think the limitations are the things that we put on ourselves. And we tell ourselves that we can or can't do. So I try to show you like two different kinds of practices, right? One in which you're out in the world and you're really not just working with one set of hands, but many. And then the other one, you know, we're sort of working on the stage together.
My husband and I do a lot of service work as well, but we also have 3 children. We also want to be artists ourselves, and we're full-time educators. How do you manage that time? When you were talking about growing your team, I got really excited about somebody else taking on the tax stuff and those things, because that is part of the time sucker.
Yeah. Have you considered getting a fiscal sponsor for the work? Oh, yeah, okay, well, good.
So here's the thing, a lot of us as educators, I went to school to be an educator. I didn't go to school to, I mean, my mind was I'm going to be an art educator. I didn't learn a lot of the business things. I've never, you know, even getting my own art out there, I didn't learn those things in school. And then when I got my master's degree, I was in an administrator school. So these are things that are foreign to me.
Well, let me burst an idea that you might have in your head, which is that artists learn those things in school too, and we don't. They don't teach it either. Well, I do. I teach it because I think students need to know it, but oftentimes schools don't. We're doing it, but my teachers did not. So I would say this is hard for some people, okay? So WHP, we're able to do that much work at that scale because we paid no one, except for the people who lived in that neighborhood. So when we raised that money, 75, 80% of it, as much as we could, was spent on that block, right? So those folks got paid. But I was a volunteer the entire time. Most of my staff were volunteers. And what I tell people is that asking people to do stuff for free, asking people to do stuff without pay doesn't mean that they can't be compensated. You just got to learn how to compensate people with other things. And not to get to like too much into like the weeds about this, but there tends to be a kind of a position in a person's life where they're more likely to be able to give you time than not. So where you're at right now, you're not that person, right? But someone who's, single and 50 years old, might have that time, or someone who's just getting out of school and doesn't have a lot over their head. Because again, like, if you have an idea that people are touched by, that they believe in, they will be a part of it, even if they're not getting paid for it, because they know that they're a part of doing something which is important. And you just have to find those people and find the right people, not anyone. You be discerning about it, but make sure they know that they're getting value from the experience, even though that value may not be money. And oftentimes when you do start paying people, it starts to kind of mess things up. So don't be afraid to ask people to be involved, but just be prepared for them to give them a different form of compensation. And then it'll grow. And then you can maybe get 2 more hours of sleep a night. I don't know if that was addressing the sort of the time conversation, but essentially what happens is it's either money or time. So if you are taking up more and more of your time, then your capacity means you need more people to take on responsibilities. So just expand that team with people whom are like you, who care about what you do. And sometimes it could be school credit, it can be people whom have a successful business and they're willing to take it on, things like that. But with the taxes, get the Fiscal Receiver and it'll change a lot. I don't do any taxes now, I don't even look at it. Anybody else?
Well, can I just piggyback on what you just said right now?
Sure.
I think one of the things, and this is something that these are like the little secrets that happen right within the art world. So one of the things I want to tell you about Edgar is that when our relationship started, I was helping him out in the studio. And he wasn't paying me. He was like, no, I don't got the money, But,
I didn't pay him at all. No.
What ended up happening is we established this friendship, and he gave me a lot of advice on the way, right? And that, that helped. I realized that at that time there's other artists that were helping him, and we became like a community where artists would help me as well, and that allowed me time. We're both married. That allows us time to spend time with our kids, with our wives, while there's some other things that are being taken care of that I don't need to do every little thing about, whether stretching my canvas or doing this and this. So that was just an area where we were able to give ourselves that time to do those things. Particularly if your interest is like Edgar was talking about a practice that it's kind of looking at art, not in the conventional way, but let's say you're looking at art in the conventional way, like you're painting in the studio, you're doing that sort of thing. How do you find the time to do that and teach? Those are some of the things that even now, I've had, people come help me out that I just send emails in it. If anyone can help me with this project, it's coming out. And when the money comes, because it will come, then I share the love, and then I'm able to pay people in that respect. But there's always something that I could give back if someone's working with me. And I think that that's a resource that we as artists can be for each other. A lot of times we don't think about it that way, but that was something I learned from him, and I've continued to do in my practice, and it's helped me out so much to be able to spend time with my kids. I have 2 boys and my wife, so that's something I just...
Yeah, thanks, buddy.
Yeah.
Thank you. You had a question back here. Yes, you.
Just want to make sure what someone's
Yeah.
saying. As far as networking was. When you're first starting out with the project, where are some good resources, or like, would you approach people who are trustees of museums? Would you go to, like performance centers? Or where would you go to connect with the people that, the movers and the shakers essentially, to help you get outside of maybe your arts councils?
Yeah, you don't really know who the movers and the shakers are. So my strategy was that I would talk to everyone. Like anybody I would meet, I would introduce myself. Hey, I'm Edgar. And I was like, and I would immediately ask them, like, what do you do? And then I would have like the fattest stack of business cards like you could imagine. And I would follow up with emails like right away, especially if I thought that they could be either they would be part of me fundraising or me friend raising. So they sort of would fall into those two categories, right? So like if you're able to connect people into that way, then you can. But oftentimes you just sort of need one or two people that are angel investors, and then they'll bring their friends. So just like, don't think you need like 1,000 people, you just need like one or two people, maybe three, that have resources and opportunities, resources and access to opportunities. So like one lawyer I met, I was trying to do something, and he got on the phone with the vice president of like Caldwell Bank, and then was like, here, talk to Edgar. And I was just like, oh my God, like I couldn't have got that meeting, and for 5 years, but in 3 seconds, that I was on the phone with him. Yeah. Do you have any other questions? I can see that we're starting to wrap up. Yes, Anna.
Given your experience in nonprofit and in community building, would you say that it's more beneficial for everybody involved to to stay outside of the nonprofit aspect and to get a fiscal sponsor?
I'd say in the beginning, it's a really good idea to get the fiscal sponsor and then scale up appropriate to what happens. So for us, we became a nonprofit because major funders like Kresge or the Warhol was like, hey, we love what you're doing, we want to support you, but we won't help you if you're not your own nonprofit. So then we became one to get that help, which was actually detrimental to the work that we were doing, unfortunately. But we did get the money, so it was a kind of a catch-22 there. But other people, have figured out other ways of doing it, like doing it as a for-profit wing with a nonprofit part. So there's different things that are available to you. Yeah, if you want to send me an email or something, I can give you some guidance about that as well. Yeah.
Is there like a database of these fiscal receiverships?
I'm sure there are. I mean, you could just type up, especially if you're doing something art and education oriented, you might just want to type that in. But then most of them, Fractured Atlas is the one that's out of New York that a lot of people use. And also, Fulcrum here in Pasadena, they don't have to be in the same city as you. Sometimes it helps because you can go in the office and sit with them. But I would just Google search arts, fiscal receivers. Organizations can be your fiscal receiver as well. So they can receive money for you, but organizations like Fulcrum, that's their only function as a nonprofit is to incubate projects, and that you get more bang for your buck. They take 6 or 7% of every dollar you raise. That's how they operate. Yeah. Okay, looks like we're wrapping up here. Do we have one final question, or are we good? Okay, thank you, everyone.